Never have there been three more radical yet life-giving invitations set before humankind, set before you. So let's look at all three of them. First is deny yourself. Here's why this is so crazy and scandalous and radical. Our culture tells us not to deny ourselves, but to find ourselves, right? Our culture's message is you're the greatest good. And if that's true, it makes sense to spare no expense pampering yourself, loving yourself, worshiping yourself, setting up yourself for a perfect pain-free life. If the naturalist story, if the atheistic story is true, and there's no next life, the logical thing to do is compile pleasure and wealth for yourself, even if those come at the expense of others. This is the one life you will ever have. And there isn't anything more, so you should make the most of it. Compile as much money, power, status, pleasure as possible, even if you have to step on other people's throats to get there, or cheat or lie or steal or whatever. Jesus' call is to deny that impulse. He knows that if we look for what we want in a spouse or our kids or our work or making money, we'll never be satisfied. If the ultimate meaning and purpose of our life is trying to be derived from there. He knows because he made us that way, right? Like notice, the most glamorous, rich, and powerful people in the world are on their third or fourth marriages. They can't stay faithful to their spouse. They're addicted to drugs or alcohol or obsessed with plastic surgeries. Why is that? They have all the square footage, the nice cars, all the bling, all the Botox in the world, and they still can't function healthily. This is what Jesus is trying to do. He's going, for many of us, our best working solution is to put ourselves at the center of the universe. We make ourselves the sun in our own universe. And Jesus says, this is the fatal error. If the foundation of our lives has no transcendent component to it, and I'm speaking to the skeptics here, if this world and its offerings are all you have, then you're going to hit a ceiling and you're going to keep wandering. The human heart goes, how do I find meaning and joy in my life? And what are our answers? If I just had a better job, if I had a better spouse, if I had better kids, if I had more money, then I'd be happy. I'd be complete in life. Looking to all those things, Jesus says, doesn't work because they're part of the problem, keeping us from the actual doctor. To keep focusing on them or ourselves keeps us from the one thing that can actually heal us. Welcoming ourselves is the very thing that becomes our undoing. Because having the world revolve around us is unbearable in the end. That's why Jesus says, don't welcome yourself, deny yourself. We're not the hero of the story. We're not the true saviors. True saviors come from the outside, not the inside. And that's why he says in Mark 8, whoever would save his own life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. And so Tim Keller says this about this text. He says, the deliberately chosen Greek word for the word life here is psyche, from which we get our word psychology. It denotes your identity, your personality, and your selfhood. Jesus' appeal is not to lose ourselves in order to lose ourselves, like Eastern philosophy teaches, but to base your life on me and the gospel. In other words, my life, death, and resurrection, not yours. Jesus says, it's not enough just to know me as a teacher or a principle for life. I went to the cross, lost my identity so you can have one. Base your life on that, not yourself. That's what he's trying to say. Deny yourself. He who loses his life will find it. Self-emptiness readies us for fullness. Our culture goes, well, self-denial, that's a loss. No, Christianity says that's the greatest gain. That's the winning move. Jonathan Edwards, who lived in the 1700s, his first sermon when he was like 19 was a sermon called Christian Happiness. And he had this kind of thesis that Christians should be happy when they embrace three truths. So anything in life comes up against you, any suffering, any pain, any difficulty, there's three truths where if you hold on to them, it will define your happiness. The first is, our bad things will turn out for good. That's what we know from the Bible. Our second thing is, our good things can never be taken away from us. That's what discipleship tells us. And three, the best things are yet to come. You hold on to those three things, you can get through anything. So long before self-help philosophy made happiness and joy about our own selfish pursuits, it was the Christian concept that happiness comes through earnestly seeking the one who created us. Second, then, Jesus says, pick up your cross. It's a fascinating image because in the first century, crosses were actually used by the Roman Empire to execute people. Revolutionaries challenging the state, which of course Jesus goes on to get crucified, but at this point they don't know that. The Roman Empire that crucified 6,000 people on a single day across a 100-mile stretch of road sends a message through crucifixion to the world. And it's that Caesar is Lord. Jesus was saying, I'm Lord. You need to follow me in all things. You need to pick up your cross. Notice Jesus doesn't say, pick up my cross, right? Our discipleship is not just a matter of accepting Jesus' pain and sacrifice for us, though a big part of it is that. No, listen, Jesus instructs his potential disciples to take up our own crosses. Our discipleship, while being centered on Jesus' cross and what it did for us, is also, here's the crazy thing, about our lives, about our own cross to bear, right? There's this cost to following Jesus. If we're to view our life, our desires, our agendas, our beliefs as dead and gone, right? Like I've been crucified with Christ, the Apostle Paul says. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. If that's kind of how we live our life, what's going to change? Everything. Why do we have to die for Jesus? Because a seed can't produce a flower or fruit or tree or anything of value until it goes into the ground and dies first. And once that happens, the way you relate to everything changes because now you're truly alive. When Jesus puts the image of a cross in front of his disciples, he's saying, this must be the shape of your life if you want to follow me. You're already dead. The only way you're ever going to be able to get enough courage in your life to sacrifice, to go over and above what you want to do is to embrace your own death to your own desires, to your emotional wants, to your needs. Even for some of you, your very lives. A while ago, I read this story about a group of missionaries and they were sailing to Africa and the captain of their boat laughed at them and said, you're going to die over there. And one of the missionaries responded, Captain, we died before we started. Meaning, those who are already dead have emptied themselves of selfish ambition. And that's what Jesus is saying. We must decrease, he must increase. Your reputation dies. The building of your own empires die if you want to follow me. So he's not trying, as many do today, to fool people into the kingdom by setting a low, comfortable bar. He's front loading the scandal and he's saying, like when I train church planters, I lead them usually by saying, what you win people with is what you win them to. And the reason I talk about that is because for many aspiring pastors, the temptation is to grow their church. And the way that they're going to grow their church is by making Christianity as easy as possible. And then this leads to flimsy theology and a flimsy life, but they set the bar of faith low, say a quick prayer, raise a hand, follow a set of 10 snappy steps to live a good life, all starting with the letter S, and boom, my church is going to grow. The problem is that this type of evangelism doesn't lead to a faith of substance. It's not a resilient faith. A faith that lasts when life falls apart. A faith where you have steel in your spine that the true gospel gives you. The Christian life is often not about victory as we talk about it all the time. It's about obedience. Obedience in the face of anything, trial, suffering, even death. And that's not always fun. And this is what I want church planters to kind of understand straight out of the gate. Bonhoeffer said it this way: when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. So Jesus is making this clear to his audience right up front. Everyone dies at some point. Most disciples throughout history, the dying occurs in a figurative way, like climb up on the cross and die. And most people throughout history, they do that. We die to our own plans, our egos, our selfish desires. However, there's actually an undercurrent of literalism in what Jesus is saying as well, right? Luke tells us that John the Baptist, the kind of example of discipleship in the Gospels, was beheaded by Herod. He actually died for this. This was the fate of how many of his disciples, his early disciples, many of them, all of the original apostles. And I say this because modern Christianity, the way that it's marketed in bookstores and movies and music, is as something safe for the whole family, right? That's how we think about it. It's like, it's safe for the whole family. It isn't meant to be, though. There's absolutely nothing safe about Christianity. Christianity is a way of life that so pushes against the way of the world that the inevitable clash results in pain and sometimes tragedy for the Christian instead of worldly success, right? So in contrast to like modern Christianity, the so-called like celebrity pastor of the Western church, you may have seen the popular Instagram account called Preachers and Sneakers, and it features pictures of pastors alongside the retail value of the clothes they're wearing, right? So you'll see a preacher up there, he's preaching the gospel, and you'll find a $3,000 jacket, $1,500 sneakers, $500 designer t-shirts. This picture of earthly success is so far from the paradigm for discipleship that Jesus lays out for us. So the New Testament paradigm is more like death and suffering that Jesus describes as taking up a cross. It's a way of life where those under the altar, as Revelation talks about, where they've died for their faith, are actually the heroes of the Christian faith, not those on stage. You know, the Oxford Christian World Encyclopedia estimates that throughout history there have been 75 million Christian martyrs, like people who died because of their faith. 45 million of which, you know when they were killed? In the 20th century. So this isn't some past thing. A few years ago, I went on a mission trip to Turkey, and just before we got there, there'd been a guy who was befriending a bunch of people in Turkey trying to lead them to Jesus. And one day he brought them into his Bible study, and they tied him up to a chair and they tortured him and killed him. And then we arrived like 2 weeks later, and the whole country was kind of rocked by this. And I remember doing evangelism on the streets of Turkey and talking to people about Jesus. And they were like, well, what about that guy who got tortured? And I said, yeah, that's the nature of the call of God in our lives. And they were like, man, and God actually used that because the spouse went on TV and said, you know what? This is what Jesus calls us to. And here's the thing, God used the death of that man, I want you to hear this, to force a cultural conversation and bring these young men to himself. Tons of evangelism was done when we were there. People were coming to know Jesus. And a terrible thought struck me in that moment. You know what it was? That it's more important to God that the gospel advances in the world than for my life to continue on another day. Think about that. You want a Bible verse for that? Luke 9. Whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. Yes, God uses our joys to glorify himself and reach people, but he also uses our pain. What's the third part of the invitation then? He says, deny yourself, pick up your cross, which is going to image of pain, and lastly, follow me. Jan David Heidegger, who's this writer, he says these words: the ultimate issue in the universe is leadership. Who you follow and what directs your life is the single most important thing about you, right? So here's what we got to understand. Christianity is about Jesus as leader, not just savior. Think about that. The word disciple occurs 269 times in the New Testament. You know how often the word Christian is found in the New Testament? 3 times. See, disciple is actually the paradigm structure of Christianity. Jesus challenges us to pick up our crosses daily. It's not about, ideas. It's not about just beliefs. It's about a living, breathing movement that has a daily impact on what you do in the everyday. Unlike Islam or Judaism or Hinduism, Christianity isn't just interested in ancient teachings recorded in a book. We worship a Savior who is alive still today, and he says, I'm still your teacher. I'm still your actual Lord. I'm your leader. This is the fulfillment of all the kind of epic tales that we tell ourselves, right? We're constantly, you think of the movies and the stories. Donald Miller wrote a book called Story Brand, where he talks about the idea of all the great heroic stories that we tell, whether it's, Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or Hunger Games or whatever. There's always kind of the same basic structure. A character has a problem, they meet a guide, that guide gives them a plan, calls them to action, and it results in either a comedy or a tragedy, right? So Luke Skywalker meets Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda, Frodo meets Gandalf, Katniss meets Haymitch, all of the, and we have this guide to tell us what to do. All of these are imitations of the true and better story, where Jesus invites us into this story where he says, I'm the hero, but I'm also the guide. Like, I'm the everyday teacher. This is what's awesome about Christianity. You don't just get a set of beliefs, you get a teacher, you get the mentor. He becomes the daily friend, guiding us in every aspect of our lives, not just our beliefs. So when we allow him to assume that role, then he promises freedom. He goes, we're going to find the meaning we were always looking for, find the joy, find the fulfillment, but we couldn't find it on our own. So then how do we do this well? Meaning, follow me, okay? I'm going to follow Jesus. How do I do that well? Well, it takes time. It takes energy. It takes focus on our end, right? Jesus called 12 normal people, just guys who were fishermen, away from their normal lives, as bankers and husbands and fathers, and he said, drop all of that and come follow me. And they did just that for 3 years until he was killed. So think about this question. Why did it take 3 years? Jesus could have just as easily written a systematic theology book, called them all together in a retreat, spent the weekend and said, here's what I want you to believe and how I want you to live. Now go and tell everybody to do it. Why didn't he do that? It's kind of how we do stuff, like in the modern church sometimes. But instead, he befriends them. He does life alongside of them in the hills of Galilee. He eats with them and sleeps with them and breathes every moment with them together for 3 years. And that's the point. If you read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers, he talks about the idea that, like, the Beatles and Mozart and all these people all throughout history, how did they become great at anything? So here's what Gladwell says. This number, 10,000 hours, comes up over and over again. 10,000 hours is equivalent to roughly 3 hours a day or 20 hours a week of practice over 10 years. No one has yet found a case in which true world-class expertise was accomplished in less time. It seems that it takes the brain this long to assimilate all that it needs to know to achieve true mastery. If we want to be great, become a master at something, 10,000 hours. So now, this might be a little too cute, but after I talked about this in a sermon one time, this woman walked up to me and she said, if you calculate the time that the disciples spent with Jesus, assuming they took a Sabbath, but otherwise spent day and night with him for 3 years, it actually equals just over 10,000 hours. It's basically like having a full-time job for 3.5 years. See, this is why Jesus didn't simply write a systematic book and give it to them. He wanted his disciples to master a way of life and being in the world. He wanted them to become experts, Mozarts, the Beatles in discipleship. And he knew time was the only way to get there. Notice in the Great Commission, the last thing Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew 28, he doesn't look at his disciples and say, here's your mission. I want you to teach everybody all I commanded. And lo, I will be with you to the end of the age. That's not what he says. Because as one writer has pointed out, even a parrot could just repeat everything Jesus commanded. No, he says, I want you to teach them to obey all I commanded. That's a whole different game. The fact that we need to get people to obey him. It's one thing to say, love your enemy, but a very different thing to actually do it. And this is where we start to enter the question of what kind of Christianity are we believing in and following? Because anything other than this massive cost of discipleship vision may not be Christianity at all. Dallas Willard years ago called it vampire Christianity, where people take or receive Jesus at his cost, but not theirs. So Willard talks about the idea. He says that a dichotomy, an idea that you can just take certain beliefs but not the life of Jesus, is a heresy. And he calls it vampire Christianity. And he says it means that you don't find Jesus all that interesting. He isn't as compelling as Instagram or Twitter or Amazon or whatever. He isn't interesting enough to spend quality time with or to read about or to learn from. You can't even bother to listen to him as your teacher, as your Lord. You don't forge a relationship because it's all hard work. What you do is you say, give me some of your blood, please. And that's all I want. In John 6, John says, disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. Why? Because this can be hard, right? The call to be faithful to Jesus is a profound call, maybe the most profound in the entire Bible. Think about marriage. Any moron can get married. Right? Anybody can dress up in a tux and marry a girl in front of a group of people and go, "Ooh, that was great." See, the thing about marriage, as one writer has said, the most important day of your marriage is not the first day, it's the last day. It's when you've lived out that 50, 60 years together and you've been faithful. That's the important, it's the obedience in the midst of it. So, because the question becomes, who is found faithful on the last day? Who is found faithful on the last day to Jesus? Who among us, until Jesus returns or takes us in death, has woken up each morning and said, I choose to follow you again today? And here's what I've realized. The only way to hear the voice of Jesus as master in those moments is if you're listening daily. Right? Over time, it becomes habitual and normal and part of your everyday life, but only when you commit to the habit. Hearing the voice of Jesus, which is what he says his sheep can do, becomes second nature to his actual disciples. So here's the challenge of all this. It is said that approximately 1 billion people on planet Earth claim to be Christians. But I would push back and say there's an important question to ask all of us right now who are watching this. In Mark chapter 10, Jesus asks two brothers, James and John, what do you want me to do for you? And in response, they both say, we want to sit at your right and your left in your glory. And Jesus rejects that, right? Basically says, you want power and prestige in the kingdom? That's not mine to give. Jesus says, no. And there's a profound question when I was reading that text one day that hit me. And it's lurking under the surface of all of us, like an unseen predator in our life. The question is this: it's not just if we're choosing to follow Jesus. There's a follow-up question. Why have you chosen to follow him? James and John, they were doing it to be successful. Give us power, give us prestige. Let us sit at your left and your right in your kingdom. You ever ask your own heart the question why you're following him? Not just if. Like, we usually applaud any gesture of intimacy toward Jesus. People are interested in Jesus, awesome, woohoo, let's go. But Jesus pushes back with a deeper question. Why are you interested in me? I know people who become Christians for all kinds of reasons, right? To get more friends, to get business relationships, to marry that girl, to absolve some guilt over something they did. This is good stuff. But the challenge is, as real as the invitation, we have to think through not only if we love and follow Jesus, but why. Is it real? Is it motivated by the fact that I get God, not just that I get certain things for myself? Have you ever asked that question? And would you be willing to ask it of yourself today? Deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow me. Such is the adventure of Christianity.